Hello everyone, I am a storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you listen this video to fall asleep, so before we beginning, please help me hit button like video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment below where are you from and what time are you watching. The rain was a tireless percussion section on the roof of Alex Miller's yellow cab, a relentless rhythm that had long since stopped being soothing and had become just another dull ache in the backdrop of his life. At 38, Alex carried the weight of New York City's endless nights in the slump of his shoulders and the perpetual shadow beneath his eyes. He wasn't exactly cynical, more like thoroughly seasoned, like the worn leather of his driver's seat that molded perfectly to his frame. This cab, with its faint, permanent scent of stale coffee, cheap air freshener, and the ghost of 1,000 different perfumes, was his second home, a metal shell navigating the unforgiving concrete jungle from dusk till dawn. It was just past 2 a.m., and the city's true insomniacs were out, or perhaps just heading home from their own graveyard shifts. Alex cruised slowly down a dimly lit street in the West Village, the kind of block where every brownstone held a story, and every shadow seemed to deepen the mystery. That's when he saw her. A woman, elegantly dressed in a dark coat, stood beneath the sickly glow of a street lamp, her hand raised. She looked like she belonged in a different, more glamorous New York than the one Alex usually inhabited. He pulled over, the hydraulics hissing softly. She opened the back door and slid in with a quiet rustle of fabric. "Upper East Side, 74th and Madison, please," she said, her voice a low murmur, almost lost beneath the drumming rain. Alex nodded, flicking the meter on. The ride was silent, punctuated only by the swish of the wipers and the distant wail of a siren. He navigated the slick streets, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. When he finally pulled up to the grand building on 74th Street, he turned to announce their arrival. "Here we are, ma'am," he began, but the words caught in his throat. The back seat was utterly, undeniably empty. Alex stared. He blinked. He leaned forward, peering into the cavernous space where she had been. Nothing. Just the dark, slightly damp upholstery. A cold shiver, not from the weather, traced a path down his spine. He checked the meter. It read $28.75, the exact fare for the distance traveled. He frowned, running a hand over his tired face. Had he imagined her? Was he finally losing it? No, he'd heard her speak. He'd seen her get in. Must have been a clever fare dodger, he reasoned, one who could vanish like smoke. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and drove off, dismissing it as a trick of the light, or perhaps just the sheer exhaustion of working another graveyard shift. A few nights later, the memory of the vanishing woman had mostly faded into the general haze of his long hours. He picked up a young man near Union Square, who seemed to be bubbling with excitement, talking animatedly into his phone. "Yeah, I'm almost there, babe. Can't wait. Got the flowers. Everything's perfect," the voice chirped. A one-sided conversation. About a date. Alex caught snippets, a smile playing on his lips. Good for him. He glanced in his rearview mirror to check the traffic, and his blood ran cold. The back seat was empty. Again, his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He could still hear the voice, clear as a bell, talking about flowers and a date. The meter was ticking, showing a steady accumulation of fare. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs. He drove on, unable to look away from the mirror, half expecting the young man to materialize, but he never did. Just before Alex reached the destination, a trendy restaurant in the Flatiron District, the voice abruptly stopped. He pulled over, his breath catching in his throat. The meter clicked too. A stop, showing a completed fare. The back seat remained stubbornly, terrifyingly empty. These occurrences, once dismissed as anomalies, began to escalate with unnerving frequency. It wasn't just the vanishing passengers anymore. Sometimes he'd hear faint whispers, like secrets, exchanged just behind his head when the cab was undeniably empty. Other times, a sudden, tinny burst of old-fashioned music, a jazz tune, a swing number, would erupt from the back seat, only to fade into silence a moment later. And the chills, deep, inexplicable chills that settled in the air, raising gooseflesh on his arms, even when the heater was blasting. Always when no one was there, but always the meter was running. The ghost fares were killing him. They didn't pay, obviously, but they devoured his time, his gas, and his sanity. His already tight finances were stretched thinner than ever. Alex started to question everything. Was he cracking up? He spent a frantic afternoon checking for carbon monoxide leaks in his cab, even went to a doctor for a quick checkup, convinced he was hallucinating. The doctor found nothing. He tried to confide in a few of the other drivers at the depot, men who'd seen it all. They either laughed, chalking it up to urban legend or too many late nights, or just gave him pitying looks, assuming he was overworked and stressed. Desperate, Alex decided to review his dashcam footage. His cab was equipped with both a forward-facing camera and an internal one, pointed at the back seat. He spent hours hunched over his laptop, fast-forwarding through endless stretches of empty road, until he hit one of the incidents. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. He watched as he pulled over, the empty back seat waiting. He watched as he drove, the meter clearly visible, ticking away the fare. And then he watched the entire journey unfold with it utterly horrifyingly. Empty back seat. No woman, no young man, no one. Just the familiar, worn upholstery. Yet the meter kept running, indicating a passenger, a journey, a destination. The video didn't offer a logical explanation. It didn't prove he was sane. Instead, it confirmed his deepest fears, or rather plunged him into an even deeper abyss of utter confusion. The ghosts weren't just in his head. They were in his cab. The rain was a tireless percussion section on the roof of Alex Miller's yellow cab, a relentless rhythm that had long since stopped being soothing and had become just another dull ache in the backdrop of his life. At 38, Alex carried the weight of New York City's endless nights in the slump of his shoulders and the perpetual shadow beneath his eyes. He wasn't exactly cynical, more like thoroughly seasoned, like the worn leather of his driver's seat that molded perfectly to his frame. This cab, with its faint, permanent scent of stale coffee, cheap air freshener, and the ghost of 1,000 different perfumes, was his second home, a metal shell navigating the unforgiving concrete jungle from dusk till dawn. Asterisk, it was just past 2 a.m., and the city's true insomniacs were out, or perhaps just heading home from their own graveyard shifts. Alex cruised slowly down a dimly lit street in the West Village, the kind of block where every brownstone held a story, and every shadow seemed to deepen the mystery. That's when he saw her. A woman, elegantly dressed in a dark coat, stood beneath the sickly glow of a street lamp, her hand raised. She looked like she belonged in a different, more glamorous New York than the one Alex usually inhabited. He pulled over, the hydraulics hissing softly. She opened the back door and slid in with a quiet rustle of fabric. "Upper East Side, 74th and Madison, please," she said, her voice a low murmur, almost lost beneath the drumming rain. Alex nodded, flicking the meter on. The ride was silent, punctuated only by the swish of the wipers and the distant wail of a siren. He navigated the slick streets, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. When he finally pulled up to the grand building on 74th Street, he turned to announce their arrival. "Here we are, Mom," he began, but the words caught in his throat. The back seat was utterly, undeniably empty. Alex stared. He blinked. He leaned forward, peering into the cavernous space where she had been. Nothing. Just the dark, slightly damp. Upholstery. A cold shiver, not from the weather, traced a path down his spine. He checked the meter. It read $28.75, the exact fare for the distance traveled. He frowned, running a hand over his tired face. Had he imagined her? Was he finally losing it? No, he'd heard her speak. He'd seen her get in. Must have been a clever fare dodger, he reasoned, one who could vanish like smoke. He sighed, rubbing his temples, and drove off, dismissing it as a trick of the light, or perhaps just the sheer exhaustion of working another graveyard shift. A few nights later, the memory of the vanishing woman had mostly faded into the general haze of his long hours. He picked up a young man near Union Square, who seemed to be bubbling with excitement, talking animatedly into his phone. "Yeah, I'm almost there, babe. Can't wait. Got the flowers. Everything's perfect," the voice chirped. A one-sided conversation about a date. Alex caught snippets, a smile playing on his lips. Good for him. He glanced in his rearview mirror to check the air. Traffic, and his blood ran cold. The back seat was empty. Again got his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He could still hear the voice, clear as a bell, talking about flowers and a date. The meter was ticking, showing a steady accumulation of fare. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs. He drove on, unable to look away from the mirror, half expecting the young man to materialize, but he never did. Just before Alex reached the destination, a trendy restaurant in the Flatiron District, the voice abruptly stopped. He pulled over, his breath catching in his throat. The meter clicked too. A stop, showing a completed fare. The back seat remained stubbornly, terrifyingly empty. These occurrences, once dismissed as anomalies, began to escalate with unnerving frequency. It wasn't just the vanishing passengers anymore. Sometimes he'd hear faint whispers, like secrets, exchanged just behind his head when the cab was undeniably empty. Other times, a sudden, tinny burst of old-fashioned music. A jazz tune, a swing number, would erupt from the backseat, only to fade into silence a moment later. And the chills, deep, inexplicable chills that settled in the air, raising gooseflesh on his arms, even when the heater was blasting. Always when no one was there, but always the meter was running. The ghost fares were killing him. They didn't pay, obviously, but they devoured his time, his gas, and his sanity. His already tight finances were stretched thinner than ever. Alex started to question everything. Was he cracking up? He spent a frantic afternoon checking for carbon monoxide leaks in his cab. Even went to a doctor for a quick checkup, convinced he was hallucinating. The doctor found nothing. He tried to confide in a few of the other drivers at the depot, men who'd seen it all. They either laughed, chalking it up to urban legend or too many late nights, or just gave him pitying looks, assuming he was overworked and stressed. Desperate, Alex decided to review his dashcam footage. His cab was equipped with both a forward-facing camera and an internal one, pointed at the back seat. He spent hours hunched over his laptop, fast-forwarding through endless stretches of empty road, until he hit one of the incidents. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. He watched as he pulled over, the empty backseat waiting. He watched as he drove, the meter clearly visible, ticking away the fare. And then he watched the entire journey unfold with an utterly, horrifyingly empty backseat. No woman, no young man, no one. Just the familiar, worn upholstery. Yet the meter kept running, indicating a passenger, a journey, a destination. Video didn't offer a logical explanation. It didn't prove he was sane. Instead, it confirmed his deepest fears, or rather plunged him into an even deeper abyss of utter confusion. The ghosts weren't just in his head. They were in his cab. Driven by a desperate need for understanding, Alex started a log. Not just a mental one, but a physical one. A battered notebook, usually reserved for mileage and gas receipts, now became a chronicle of the impossible. He noted every ghost fare, the exact time and pickup spot, the phantom destination. What he perceived of the passenger, the well-dressed woman, the excited young man, a gruff older voice, a child's faint giggle. He meticulously wrote down any sound, any whisper, any inexplicable chill dot. As the pages filled, a chilling pattern emerged. So many of these spectral journeys, regardless of their starting point, seemed to converge on or mention an older, neglected part of the city. Not the gleaming glass towers of Midtown, but the forgotten, rusty edges of Brooklyn, near the old waterfront, where abandoned warehouses stood like skeletal giants. It was an industrial graveyard, far from the usual hustle and bustle of his. Paying customers dot the desperation gnawed at him. He spent his off hours, what little sleep-deprived time he had, hunched over his cheap laptop, a mug of cold coffee always within reach. He scoured the internet, typing in frantic searches. NYC ghost taxis, vanishing passengers urban legend, unexplained disappearances New York. He stumbled upon obscure online forums, dusty digital archives of local newspapers. That's where he first saw the chilling headlines, decades old. Midnight rider cases remain unsolved. Taxi passengers vanish into thin air. A series of unsolved disappearances from the 1970s, where people, sometimes even the drivers themselves, simply vanished after hailing a cab. The cases had gone cold, buried under layers of bureaucracy and forgotten memories. One of the forum posts mentioned a retired police dispatcher, Martha Jenkins, known for her photographic memory and an uncanny knack for recalling the most unusual calls. Alex, with nothing left to lose, tracked her down through a convoluted chain of old phone numbers and retired civil servant directories. Martha lived in a small, cluttered apartment in Queens, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and overflowing filing cabinets. She was sharp, with eyes that missed nothing, even behind thick-rimmed glasses. Alex laid out his story, the dashcam footage playing silently on his phone. Martha listened, her expression unreadable, occasionally nodding. "Midnight rider cases," she finally murmured, her voice raspy with age. "Always felt something off about. Those, too many loose ends." She admitted the cases were abruptly closed, almost swept under the rug. She possessed a vast, unofficial archive of old police reports, witness statements, and her own meticulously kept notes from her long career. Over the next few weeks, Alex's cab became a mobile research lab, and Martha's apartment their headquarters. They spread out old, brittle maps of NYC, tracing routes, comparing them to Alex's ghost fares. They cross-referenced names mentioned in Martha's unofficial files with the fragments of conversations Alex had overheard from his spectral passengers. A chilling realization dawned on. The ghosts weren't just random spirits. They were the victims of the Midnight Rider cases, trapped in a loop, trying to complete their last journey, trying to communicate. Many of them had last been seen or heard near that same neglected industrial area. Alex's current ghosts seemed drawn to Alex. Desperate for official help, tried to approach Detective Miller, the lead investigator on the original Midnight Rider. Cases, now a grizzled, retired man living a quiet life in Brooklyn. Miller, a man hardened by decades of urban decay, scoffed. "Ghosts, son? You're chasing shadows. Some things are best left buried. You're just stirring up old pain." He warned Alex to drop it, dismissing him as a delusional, overworked driver. The constant lack of sleep, the paranoia of knowing his cab was a conduit for the dead, the financial strain. It all began to take a severe toll. Alex's eyes were perpetually bloodshot, his movements jerky. His friends, noticing his gaunt appearance and obsessive talk, worried about his mental state. At the depot, his boss threatened to pull his medallion, citing erratic work schedules and drastically declining earnings. Alex was barely holding it together. The ghosts themselves seemed to sense his growing understanding, or perhaps his desperation. They became more insistent, more vivid. They no longer just vanished. They flickered, translucent forms appearing and disappearing in his rearview mirror. They'd point with translucent fingers, whisper specific names or street numbers, their spectral faces contorting in frustration when Alex couldn't quite grasp their meaning. One night, the elegant woman from his first incident appeared, her form almost solid. She didn't speak, but she repeatedly pointed towards a distinctive, dilapidated clock tower that loomed over the industrial zone, a crumbling sentinel against the skyline. Martha, seeing Alex's drawing of it, gasped. "The old Stuyvesant clock. Tower," she murmured, flipping through a dusty report. Vaguely mentioned in a missing persons report from '74. Last known whereabouts, near there. The pieces were falling into place, leading Alex directly into the heart of the mystery. The dilapidated clock tower loomed in the distance, a skeletal finger pointing to the sky. The ghosts in Alex's cab were no longer just whispers and chills. They were almost solid, translucent figures flickering in his rearview mirror, their faces etched with a desperate urgency. The elegant woman from his first fare sat directly behind him, her eyes wide, her spectral hand pointing repeatedly towards the crumbling tower. A young man, the excited date-goer, gestured wildly towards the industrial wasteland below it. The air in the cab grew heavy, thick with an icy dread that wasn't just the late-night chill. Guided by their frantic, silent urgings, Alex drove his taxi deeper into the forgotten industrial zone. The paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt and then to dirt tracks overgrown with weeds. Abandoned factories stood like hollowed-out giants, their windows broken, their walls covered in graffiti. The scent of rust and decay hung in the air. The ghosts in his back seat were no longer flickering. They were almost fully formed, their faces clearer, their desperation almost palpable. They were urging him forward, their spectral hands pushing. Against the back of his seat, their silent pleas echoing in his mind. Finally, they led him to a place so hidden, so overgrown. It seemed to have been swallowed by the city itself. Behind a dense curtain of ivy and crumbling brick walls, nestled between two colossal, forgotten warehouses, was an old, forgotten taxi depot. The sign, barely legible, read Godum Cab CO. The gates were rusted shut, vines snaking through the iron bars. Alex forced them open with a grunt, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, the decay was profound. Dust motes danced in, the faint moonlight filtering through a gaping hole in the roof. Rusted taxi parts, a detached door, a broken headlight, a stack of flat tires lay scattered like forgotten toys. The air was still and cold, heavy with the weight of decades. The ghosts, now almost entirely solid, spilled out of his cab, their forms shimmering. They moved with a newfound purpose, leading him through the debris-strewn space, past skeletal car frames and ancient oil-stained machinery. They stopped at a specific, hidden section of the depot behind a stack of old, water-damaged wooden crates. The elegant woman pointed to the ground. Alex, his heart hammering against his ribs, began to dig with a rusted shovel he found nearby. The earth was soft, disturbed. After only a few scoops, his shovel hit something solid. He dug faster, frantic, until the grim truth began to emerge. There, beneath the accumulated grime and forgotten junk, was a makeshift grave. He uncovered human remains, skeletal hands still clutching fragments of their past lives. A tarnished silver locket, a unique gold watch, a driver's license from the 1970s with a faded photo, undeniable proof. These were the Midnight Rider. Victims, and then he saw it. A small engraved taximeter, distinct from his own modern one, its numbers frozen in time. And next to it, a faded, blood-stained uniform patch. It bore the emblem of Godom Cab CO. The realization hit Alex with the force of a physical blow. The killer hadn't just been a taxi driver. He had been their taxi driver, operating from this very depot, preying on his own clientele, using his cab as a tool of terror. He had never been caught, likely dying years ago, leaving his victims trapped in their final, unfinished journeys. As the grim discovery was fully unveiled, a profound change swept through the depot. The spectral forms of the victims, standing around the makeshift grave, no longer looked distressed or desperate. Their translucent faces, once contorted in frustration, softened into expressions of calm and serenity. They gazed at Alex, their eyes filled with an overwhelming silent gratitude. A faint, almost imperceptible light seemed to emanate from them, and then, slowly, gracefully, they began to fade away, their forms dissolving into the dust-filled air until they were gone. Finally, after decades of restless wandering, they were at peace. Alex stood there, covered in dirt and sweat, the unearthed evidence stark before him. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling, and immediately called Martha. Her voice, usually so sharp, wavered when he told her what he'd found. Martha, in turn, wasted no time contacting Detective Miller. Despite his initial skepticism, Miller arrived at the depot, his face grim. When confronted with the undeniable evidence, the remains, the personal effects, the old taximeter, the uniform patch, his cynicism crumbled. Forensic teams were called in, swarming the forgotten depot. The remains were confirmed, linked unequivocally to the decades-old cold cases. The Midnight Rider cases, unsolved for nearly 50 years, were finally closed. News reports blared across the city, bringing a long-awaited sense of closure to the victims' families, many of whom had given up hope. Alex Miller, the cynical, struggling taxi driver, was no longer just a face in the crowd. He was hailed as a local hero, the man who, guided by the restless dead, had brought peace to forgotten souls and solved one of the city's most notorious cold cases. He found himself giving interviews, his face on the front page of newspapers. He might decide to write a book about his extraordinary experiences, or perhaps simply find a new sense of purpose and direction in his life, one that no longer felt so bound by the endless grind. He continued to drive his cab, but the empty seats no longer filled him with dread or confusion. Instead, they brought a quiet understanding of the unseen world, a silent promise that some mysteries, no matter how old, could still find their light. The city, through news reports and memorials, finally remembered its forgotten victims. The eerie legend of the ghost passengers transformed from a chilling urban myth into a compelling story of heroism, perseverance, and the ultimate triumph of justice, even across the veil between worlds. The days that followed the discovery at the Godom Cab Co. depot were a blur of flashing cameras and shouted questions for Alex. He was no longer just Alex Miller, the struggling taxi driver. He was the ghost driver, a Midnight Rider's deliverer. News crews camped outside his small apartment building. Reporters vied for exclusive interviews, and his phone rang off the hook. He found himself on morning talk shows, his gruff voice softening as he recounted the eerie tales of his spectral passengers. The initial skepticism of the public quickly turned to awe and fascination as forensic evidence confirmed every detail he'd uncovered. Martha Jenkins, a quiet smile on her face, often sat beside him during these interviews, lending her own steady presence and the weight of her long-held suspicions. Detective Miller, too, made public statements, his once cynical demeanor replaced by a grudging respect for Alex and a profound sense of relief that the decades-old blight on his career was finally resolved. The city, which had whispered about the midnight rider for generations, now had a hero. A story of justice rising from the most unlikely of places. Alex's financial strain eased considerably. Publishers, eager for a true crime sensation, offered him a book deal. He decided to take it. He wasn't a writer, but he had a story to tell, one that deserved to be heard in full. He spent his days dictating his experiences, recalling every chill, every whisper, every desperate gesture of the ghosts. His cab, once a lonely metal box, became a symbol, parked prominently in front of his publisher's office for a photo shoot. Its worn upholstery now part of a legend. He still drove, though not as often, and not with the same desperate urgency for fares. His old boss, who had threatened to fire him, now treated him with a mix of reverence and slight fear. Alex often took his cab out late at night, not to work, but just to drive. The empty back seat no longer felt like a void waiting to be filled by a phantom. Instead, it felt different. Sometimes in the quiet hum of the engine, he'd feel a faint, almost imperceptible warmth, a whisper of a presence that was no longer distressed, but calm. It was a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that the world held more than met the eye, and that he had played a part in setting things right. A small, tasteful memorial was erected near the old industrial zone, a simple stone bench and a plaque, dedicating it to the midnight rider victims, finally at peace. Families, some elderly, some who had only heard stories of their lost loved ones, gathered there, tears and gratitude flowing freely. Alex attended the dedication, standing quietly. In the back, watching the sunlight glint off the polished stone. He wasn't looking for praise, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had helped bring closure. Life for Alex Miller had irrevocably changed. He was still a cynical man in many ways. New York City had a way of keeping you grounded, but the edge had softened. He carried the weight of what he'd seen, but it was no longer a burden of fear, but a badge of honor. He had faced the unknown, walked with the dead, and brought them home. And as he drove his cab through the familiar, bustling streets, he knew that, while the ghost passengers were gone, their journey had given him a purpose he never knew he was missing. The book, titled The Midnight Rider's Deliverer, My Journey with the Ghost Passengers, hit shelves with a splash. It wasn't a literary masterpiece, Alex would readily admit, but it was raw, honest, and undeniably true. The public devoured it. It became a bestseller, propelling Alex from local curiosity to national sensation. He found himself on more talk shows, not just morning ones, but primetime interviews. His gruff voice a strange but compelling contrast to the polished sets. He spoke of the chills, the whispers, the quiet gratitude of the fading spirits, always with a grounded, almost reluctant air that only made his story more believable, not the money from the book deal and subsequent movie rights. Yes, a movie was in the works, was more than Alex had ever dreamed of. He moved from his cramped apartment to a slightly larger, sunnier one still in the city, but with a view that wasn't just a brick wall. He bought a new, reliable car for personal use, but his old cab remained. He had it professionally cleaned, the faint smells of stale coffee and worn upholstery replaced with a fresh, neutral scent. But he kept the dents and scratches, each one a memory of a long night or a bumpy ride. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a relic, a silent partner in his extraordinary journey. He still drove it sometimes, usually in the late afternoon, just before the real rush hour or on quiet Sunday mornings. He'd cruise the familiar streets, no meter running, no destination in mind, just feeling the hum of the engine, the pulse of the city beneath his wheels. The empty back seat, once a source of dread, now held a strange comfort. He'd occasionally feel that faint warmth, that whisper of peace, a reminder that he hadn't imagined it all, that he had truly helped. But his newfound fame came with its own peculiar baggage. People, emboldened by his story, started seeking him out. Not just fans wanting autographs, but others with their own unexplained experiences. They'd send him letters, email him, even tried to flag down his cab, convinced he was some kind of urban shaman. Mr. Miller. A woman with wide, frightened eyes once stammered, pulling him aside outside a coffee shop. "My grandmother's antique music box plays on its own, always when no one's home. Do you think?" Alex, still the cynic at heart, would listen patiently, a tired but kind look in his eyes. He wasn't a paranormal investigator, he'd explain, just a guy who got lucky or unlucky, depending on how you looked at it. He'd offer common-sense explanations first. Faulty wiring, drafts, old house creaks. But sometimes a story would linger. A detail would snag in his mind, and he'd find himself offering a quiet, non-committal piece of advice, usually about finding peace or letting go. He never charged for these impromptu consultations. It wasn't about the money. It was about the strange, unexpected connection he now had to the city's hidden currents. Martha Jenkins, now a minor celebrity herself, often joined him for quiet dinners, sharing amused glances over the latest bizarre fan mail. Detective Miller, having fully embraced his role in the case's closure, would occasionally call Alex, not about new cold cases, but just to chat, a bond forged in the shared strangeness of their experience. Alex Miller, the ghost driver, found a new rhythm to his life. He was still grounded, still saw the grit and grime of New York, but he also saw the unseen, the echoes of lives lived and lost, the quiet mysteries that hummed beneath the city's surface. His journey with the ghost passengers had ended, but it had opened his eyes to a world he never knew existed, leaving him with a quiet understanding and a very unique place in the bustling, unforgiving heart of the city. He was no longer just driving a cab. He was navigating the unseen, one quiet, reflective mile at a time. The peculiar baggage of Alex's fame wasn't always heavy. Sometimes it was just odd. He'd get letters written in glitter pen, asking if he could communicate with a lost poodle's spirit. Emails would arrive, detailing dreams that felt too real, or objects that seemed to move on their own. Most of the time, Alex would offer a polite, no-nonsense reply, check the house for drafts, talk to a grief counselor, maybe get a carbon monoxide detector. He wasn't a medium, or a psychic, or even an expert. He was just a guy who'd driven some very particular fares. But then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a woman named Clara approached him after a book signing at a small independent bookstore in Brooklyn. She wasn't frantic or wide-eyed like some. She was quiet, almost weary, with deep lines around her kind eyes. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I know you usually deal with the departed, but I have something happening that no one can explain, and I don't know who else to turn to." Alex, signing a copy of his book for a teenager, nodded slowly. "Go on, ma'am." Clara lived in an old brownstone in Park Slope. For the past 6 months, every night, exactly. At 3:17 a.m., the lights in her living room would flicker wildly for about 30 seconds. Not just dim, but a frantic dance of on and off, like a disco ball gone mad. Her old radio, even when unplugged, would emit a burst of static, and she would feel an intense, localized cold spot, always in the same corner of the room, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated in her teeth. Electricians had checked everything, multiple times. They found nothing. No loose wires, no power surges on the grid, no faulty appliances. The power company shrugged. Her doctor suggested stress. "It's not a ghost," Clara insisted, her voice gaining a little strength. "There's no presence, no voices, no feeling of someone being there. Just that hum, and the cold, and the lights." She looked at him with a desperate plea. "It's like the house is trying to tell me something, but I don't speak its language." Alex, usually quick with a logical dismissal, found himself pausing. A cold spot, electrical anomalies, a hum, but no ghost. This was different. It wasn't about the dead trying to find peace. It sounded like a raw, untamed energy, something unanchored. His cynical mind tried to find the cracks. Old wiring, a neighbor's rogue hum radio, a subway line running too close. But Clara had clearly done her homework. He found himself agreeing to visit. Not as an investigator, he told her, but as a curious observer. He still had his old cab, the one that had become a legend. He drove it to Park Slope a few nights later, parking it discreetly down the street from Clara's brownstone. A familiar, worn upholstery and the faint scent of old coffee were oddly comforting, a reminder of his own strange journey. Clara's brownstone was elegant, but with that subtle wear that spoke of generations lived within its walls. She showed him the living room. It was cozy, filled with books and a comfortable armchair. The corner she described felt unremarkable. Alex checked the outlets, ran his hand along the wall. Nothing. He stayed up with her, nursing a lukewarm coffee, waiting. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly in the quiet room. 3:15 a.m. 3:16 a.m. Alex felt a prickle of anticipation, a familiar tightening in his gut that he hadn't felt since the ghost passengers were guiding him to the depot. Then, at precisely 3:17 a.m., it happened. The overhead light fixture above them began to strobe, a frantic, blinding pulse. The radio on a nearby shelf, unplugged and silent moments before, crackled with a burst of static so loud it made Alex jump. And in that specific corner, a wave of intense cold washed over them, making his breath mist. And then he heard it. A low, persistent hum, vibrating not just in his teeth, but deep in his bones. It wasn't a mechanical hum. It was something else, something alive, yet not. 30 seconds later, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light settled, the static vanished, the cold dissipated, and the hum faded into silence. Clara, pale but resolute, looked at him. "See?" She whispered. Alex stood there, a knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen a lot of impossible things, but this was new. This wasn't a message from the dead. This was a raw, unexplained phenomenon, a glitch in the fabric of the city he thought he knew. His cynicism hadn't prepared him for something so utterly devoid of a human narrative. He was no longer just the ghost driver. He was now, perhaps, something else entirely, a reluctant witness to the city's deeper, stranger pulse. And for the first time in a long time, Alex Miller felt a shiver that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a new kind of mystery unfolding before him. Alex stared at the now still living room, the lingering chill on his skin, more profound than any cold spot he'd felt from a ghost. Clara sat on her armchair, a faint tremor in her hands, but her eyes held a strange mix of terror and vindication. "Well," Alex said, the word sounding inadequate in the quiet room. "That wasn't a squirrel in the attic." Clara managed a weak smile. "No, Mr. Miller, it wasn't." He paced the small room, running his hand over the polished wood of a bookshelf, then touching the cold spot again. It was just a regular wall. No wires, no pipes, no obvious source. The hum, though gone, still seemed to resonate in the air, a phantom vibration. "It's not a message, is it?" Alex murmured, thinking aloud. "Like a spirit trying to tell you where their body is buried or something." Clara shook her head. "No, that's what I tried to explain. There's no intent. No sadness, no anger, no presence. It's just happening. Like the house is having a seizure." That was it. A seizure. An uncontrolled burst of something. Alex thought about the Midnight Rider ghosts, their desperate, purposeful gestures. This was chaotic, raw, almost mindless. It felt less like a whisper and more like a grunt. He stayed for another night, just to confirm. And at precisely 3:17 a.m., the lights danced, the radio crackled, the cold returned, and the hum vibrated through the floorboards. It was utterly consistent, a clockwork anomaly. Have you ever looked into the history of this place? Alex asked Clara the next morning, over lukewarm coffee and stale bagels. He was back to his old ways, trying to find a logical thread, even in the illogical. Not just the brownstone, but this specific spot? Clara frowned. It's been in my family for 3 generations. Before that, it was built in the late 1800s. Just a regular residential plot, as far as I know. Alex nodded, stirring his coffee. Right, but sometimes things happen under the surface. Old infrastructure, forgotten projects, weird stuff. His mind drifted to old subway tunnels, abandoned power stations, anything that might explain. A localized energy discharge. He left Clara's brownstone with a new kind of obsession. His taxi, once a vehicle for the departed, now felt like a research vessel for the truly unexplained. He started driving Clara's neighborhood, Park Slope, with a different eye. He wasn't looking for ghosts. He was looking for anomalies. He checked old city maps, poring over them in a coffee shop late at night, tracing forgotten water mains, old gas lines, even rumored underground passages from Prohibition days. He called Martha Jenkins, describing the phenomenon in vague, non-ghostly terms. Martha, ever pragmatic, suggested he check for old electrical substations or forgotten utility tunnels. New York's a layered cake, Alex, she'd said. You never know what's buried under the frosting. He found nothing obvious. The brownstone stood on solid ground, surrounded by other brownstones, a picture of quiet, respectable Brooklyn. Yet, every night at 3:17 a.m., a glitch in the matrix occurred in Clara's living room. Then, one afternoon, while waiting for a fare near Prospect Park, Alex overheard a conversation between 2 elderly men on a park bench. They were talking about the old trolley lines that used to run through Park Slope, long before cars dominated the streets. One mentioned a specific line, the Atlantic Avenue spur, that had a reputation for being temperamental. Used to make the streetlights flicker on a bad day. That old thing? One man chuckled, tapping his cane. Especially near the old power converter station they had down by the old clock tower. Always humming, that place was. Right before they tore it down in the 50s. Alex's ears perked up. Humming, flickering lights. Old clock tower. He knew that clock tower. It was near the old industrial zone, the one the midnight rider ghosts had pointed him towards. But this was Park Slope, a different part of the city entirely. Could there be a connection? He returned to his maps, overlaying old trolley routes with current street grids. He found the Atlantic Avenue spur, a forgotten artery running directly beneath Clara's brownstone. And then he found the location of that old power converter station. It wasn't directly under Clara's house, but it was surprisingly close, just a few blocks away. Now a small, unassuming community garden. Alex drove his cab to the community garden. It was a peaceful spot, filled with raised beds of vegetables and flowers. But in the center, almost overlooked, was a small, crudely built shed, locked with a heavy padlock. It looked out of place, too sturdy for a garden shed, with a thick concrete foundation that seemed to sink into the earth. It wasn't listed on any current city records as anything other than garden storage. He felt the familiar prickle of anticipation, the same one that had led him to the taxi depot. This wasn't a ghost, but it was a trail, a thread leading into the city's forgotten past, a different kind of mystery. This hum, this cold, this frantic dance of light, it felt like a residual echo, a trapped energy from a bygone era desperately trying to break through. Alex Miller, the ghost driver, was about to discover that the city's heart held more than just the echoes of the dead. It held the remnants of its own strange, forgotten pulse. Alex stepped out of his cab, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the community garden. The air here felt different, not just the usual city. But a faint, almost imperceptible vibration under his feet. He walked slowly, passing rows of ripening tomatoes and colorful flowers, until he stood before the small, sturdy shed. It was made of rough, dark wood, aged and weathered, with a thick, almost bunker-like concrete base that sank into the earth. The padlock on the door was old and rusted, but looked strong. Alex pressed his palm against the wooden wall. Nothing. He leaned closer, listening. For a moment, he thought he felt a faint tremor, a low thrumming that seemed to come from deep within the ground. It was like a sleeping giant, breathing softly. He walked around the shed, his eyes scanning for any clue. On the back, half hidden by overgrown ivy, he found a small, corroded metal plate. He scraped away the dirt and grime with his thumbnail. Faintly, he could make out etched letters. PSE Co. Converter Station. No. 7S, 1912. C Co. Park Slope Electric Company. This was it. This was the old power converter station the old man in the park had mentioned. It hadn't been completely torn down. It had been buried, or at least its core had. Alex pulled out his phone, snapped a picture of the plate, and sent it to Martha. Found something, he typed. Think this is the source of Clara's problem. Old power station. Martha called back almost immediately. Converter station No. 7? Buried that thing decades ago. Too much trouble to fully dismantle, so they just built over it. Concrete, then the garden. Why? What's it doing? It's humming, Alex explained, looking at the shed. And I think it's still active, in a weird way. Every night at 3:17 a.m., Clara's house goes wild. Lights flicker, cold spots, that hum. Her house is right over the old Atlantic Avenue spur line. This station powered that line. Residual energy, Martha mused, like a battery that won't completely die. Or a ghost of electricity. Fascinating. Alex spent the next few days not driving, but researching. He found old city planning documents, newspaper archives. The Park Slope Electric Company had indeed buried the converter station in the late 1950s. It was deemed too expensive and disruptive to completely remove the massive machinery and underground conduits. They'd simply sealed it, poured concrete, and eventually the garden grew over it. No one had thought it could still cause a problem. That night, Alex returned to Clara's brownstone. He didn't want to disturb her, so he parked his cab a block away and walked back, watching her house from the street. At precisely 3:17 a.m., a faint, low hum resonated through the quiet street. He saw the lights in Clara's living room flicker, just for a second, then settle. A cold gust of wind, though the night was still, swept past him. It wasn't the distressed energy of the Midnight Rider victims. It was a raw, primal energy, a forgotten pulse of the city itself. The next morning, Alex explained it all to Clara. She listened, her eyes wide, as he described the buried converter station and the residual energy. So, it's not a ghost? She asked, a mix of relief and wonder in her voice. No, Alex said, shaking his head. It's a different kind of ghost. A ghost of power. A forgotten part of the city, still trying to live. Clara touched the wall where the cold spot had been. So, what do we do? Alex frowned. That's the hard part. You can't just dig up an old power station in the middle of a community garden. It would be a massive city project. Permits, money, everything. So, it just keeps happening? She asked, A hint of resignation. Alex thought for a moment. Maybe. Or maybe we can find a way to damp it down. Insulate it. Like putting a blanket over a noisy engine. I'll talk to Martha. She knows people in the city's infrastructure department. Maybe there's some old wiring diagram, some way to fully decommission it without tearing up half of Park Slope. He left Clara's brownstone with a sense of accomplishment, even if the problem wasn't fully solved. He had, at least, understood it. He had pulled back another curtain on the city's hidden life. His cab, his second home, no longer just transported the echoes of the dead. It now carried him through a city where forgotten history hummed beneath the streets, where old power stations pulsed with forgotten energy, and where every corner held a new, strange secret. Alex Miller, the man who saw the unseen, was no longer just the ghost driver. He was becoming the city's reluctant historian, its quiet archaeologist of the unexplained. And for the first time in a long time, the concrete jungle felt less like a cage and more like an endless, unfolding mystery. Alex and Martha sat across from each other at a small diner counter. Maps and old city blueprints spread between them. The smell of frying bacon filled the air, a stark contrast to the dusty archives they'd been sifting through. "Okay," Martha said, tapping a finger on a faded diagram of the old Atlantic Avenue spur. The main conduits for Converter Station No. 7 ran right under Clara's block. They were supposed to be cut and capped when they buried the place in the 50s. Supposed to be, Alex echoed, stirring his coffee. But what if they weren't? Or, what if a charge got trapped? Like static electricity, but on a massive scale, still trying to find ground. Their first calls to the city's Department of Environmental Protection were met with polite confusion. Converter Station No. 7. Sir, that's been gone for 60 years. Then the Department of Buildings. We only deal with current structures, not buried historical anomalies. It was like talking to a brick wall made of paperwork. Each department passing the buck. Martha, however, was a master of navigating such walls. She pulled out her old rotary phone, a relic she still preferred, and started making calls. Not to official lines, but to old acquaintances, retired engineers, and former city workers. Remember old Manelli from Public Works? He knew everything about those old lines. Days turned into a week. Alex still drove his cab, but his mind was elsewhere, always turning over the problem of the humming shed. He'd check on Clara, who reported the 3:17 a.m. hum was still happening, a low, unsettling pulse through her home. It wasn't violent, but it was a constant, unsettling presence. Then Martha got a hit. "Got a lead, Alex," she said, her voice crackling with excitement over the phone. "My old friend Frank from the Department of Water and Power." He remembered a guy. A real oddball, worked for the city for decades, a kind of unofficial historian of infrastructure. Named Elias Thorne. They called him the Conduit Whisperer because he supposedly knew every pipe and wire under the 5 boroughs. Elias Thorne lived in a cluttered brownstone in Brooklyn, stacks of old maps and technical manuals piled high like ancient ruins. He was a wiry man with thick glasses and a beard that seemed to have a life of its own. He listened to Alex's story, nodding, slowly, occasionally stroking his beard. Converter Station No. 7, Thorne finally said, his voice raspy. "A beast, that one. Powerful. Too powerful, some said. They didn't just bury it, son. They sealed it, like a tomb. But energy, true energy, it finds a way. Especially if the grounding was compromised." He pulled out a massive, hand-drawn map, so old it felt fragile. "See here," he pointed with a trembling finger. "These are the main power lines. And this," he traced a faint, almost invisible line. "This was a secondary grounding conduit. Ran directly to the East River. If that broke, if it corroded." Thorne explained that the original engineers in their haste to seal the station, might have overlooked a critical grounding point, or perhaps it had simply failed over the decades. The residual energy, instead of dissipating safely into the earth or river, was now seeking an outlet. And Clara's house, being directly above the old conduits, was acting like a giant, unintended antenna. "You need to reground it," Thorne declared, tapping the map. "Find that old conduit, or run a new one. Get that energy flowing where it's supposed to go. It's like a short circuit, but underground, and it's using Clara's house as the path." The idea was simple, but the execution was not. It meant digging carefully in a community garden near a structure that was technically buried city property. It meant getting permits, explaining ghosts of electricity to skeptical officials, and finding a crew willing to undertake such a peculiar task. Alex felt a familiar surge of determination. This wasn't about ghosts of the dead anymore, but ghosts of the living city itself. He looked at Elias Thorne, the conduit whisperer, a man who saw the city's veins and arteries beneath its skin. Alex, the ghost driver, felt a kinship. They were both seeing the unseen, just in different spectrums. Armed with Thorne's insights and Martha's persistence, they started anew. This time, they didn't talk about hums or cold spots. They spoke of potential infrastructural instability, unaccounted for electrical discharge, and historical site preservation with a focus on public safety. Martha's old contacts opened doors that Alex's direct approach could not. It was a slow, grinding process. Meetings with mid-level city officials who squinted at Thorne's hand-drawn maps. Debates over budget and liability. The city was a behemoth, slow to turn. But Alex had learned patience from the Midnight Rider cases. He knew that sometimes the most profound truths were buried deepest and required the most effort to unearth. Clara, meanwhile, reported the hum was still there, a constant, low thrum beneath her life. It wasn't menacing, not like the ghosts had been, but it was a drain, a subtle reminder that her home wasn't quite her own. Alex knew he couldn't give up. He had to find a way to quiet the city's forgotten pulse. The city, a titan of concrete and steel, was finally beginning to yield. Its secrets. After weeks of relentless lobbying, of Martha's strategic deployment of official-sounding jargon, and Elias Thorne's undeniable, if esoteric expertise, the city finally caved. Not because they believed in ghost electricity, but because the phrase unaccounted for electrical discharge with potential for long-term structural degradation had a way of cutting through bureaucratic red tape. A permit for an exploratory infrastructural assessment was granted, albeit with a mountain of disclaimers. The dig began on a crisp autumn morning, just as the first rays of sun kissed the tops of the skyscrapers. A small, specialized crew, overseen by a skeptical but diligent city engineer named Henderson, set up in the community garden. Alex, Martha, and Thorne watched from a respectful distance. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and anticipation. The excavators worked, slowly, carefully, peeling back layers of soil that had remained undisturbed for half a century. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Then, a metallic thud. The crew paused. Henderson, wiping sweat from his brow, peered into the trench. "Looks like a conduit," he grunted, "and a big one." Thorne, his eyes gleaming behind his thick glasses, shuffled forward. "That's it," he whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. "The secondary grounding line. See the corrosion? It's completely compromised." The conduit was indeed a rusted, crumbling shell, barely holding its shape. Over decades, water had seeped in, corroding the vital grounding connection that should have dissipated the station's residual energy into the East River. Instead, it had been pooling, building, until Clara's house, sitting directly above. The defunct station became the path of least resistance for the trapped current. A specialized electrical crew was called in, their equipment humming with a very real, very current kind of energy. They carefully disconnected the old, failed conduit and installed a new, robust grounding rod, driving it deep into the earth, directly connecting the old station's energy to the river once more. It was a painstaking process, but by late afternoon, the connection was complete. The ground was filled back in, the disturbed earth smoothed over. Alex drove straight to Clara's house. He didn't bother knocking. The door was ajar, and he stepped inside. The air was still quiet, no hum, no low thrum beneath his feet. Clara sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands, a look of profound, almost disbelieving peace on her face. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The hum. It's truly gone." She looked at Alex, her eyes welling up. "Thank you, Alex, thank you." Justice, Alex realized, wasn't always about catching a killer. Sometimes it was about bringing quiet to a home, about regrounding the restless energy of a forgotten city dot in the days that followed. The city's official report cited unforeseen infrastructural decay and proactive maintenance. There was no mention of ghost electricity or conduit whisperers. But for Alex, Martha, and Thorne, the truth was clear. The city had another secret, and they had helped unearth it. Alex continued to drive his cab. The ghost driver now saw the city through a new lens. He still ferried the living, but he also felt the pulse of the forgotten, the hum of the unseen. He knew the city was a vast, intricate machine, its gears grinding beneath the asphalt, its wires carrying not just power, but echoes of lives lived and energies long dormant. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't on the news, nor did he seek it. He was the city's quiet confidant, its accidental medium, privy to the whispers of its past and the hum of its present. Martha, satisfied, returned to her unofficial archives, occasionally calling Alex with a new, baffling snippet from an old police blotter, a fresh mystery for them to unravel. Elias Thorne, the conduit whisperer, became a trusted, if eccentric, consultant, his knowledge of the city's hidden veins proving invaluable. Alex Miller, the cynical taxi driver, had found his purpose. His cab was still his second home, but now it was a vessel not just for passengers, but for exploration. He drove, not just through streets, but through layers of time, listening to the city's heart, understanding that every corner held a story, every hum a history, and every silence a secret finally laid to rest. The concrete jungle was no longer a cage. It was an endless, unfolding mystery, and Alex Miller was its most unlikely and most dedicated guide.